بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله وكفى وسلام على عباده الذين اصطفى أما بعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Continuing our journey of fiqh, we're talking about cleanliness and purity, and in today's lesson particularly we talk about the rules related to water of a well. The scholars explain, and we will be looking quite a bit into when impurity falls into a well, or when particular animals or creatures fall into a well, does the well water become contaminated? Does it become impure? If it does, how to purify that? So the scholars explain, and they say that إذا وقعت في البئر نجاسة, that if an impurity falls into a well, ولو كانت قليلة, even though it may be little, كقطرة دم, maybe it's just one drop of blood, or qatrati khamrin, or one drop of wine that is particularly derived from dates or grapes. وجب إخراج ما في البئر من الماء, then it becomes necessary and binding upon an individual to remove all the water of that well. And إذا وقع في البئر حيوان نجس العين, if an animal that is intrinsically impure falls into a well كالخنزير, like a pig, like a swine, وجب إخراج ما في البئر من الماء, then it becomes necessary to remove all the water of that well, سواء مات الخنزير في البئر أو خرج حيا, irrespective of whether that pig comes out from the well dead or alive, وسواء وصل فمه إلى الماء أو لم يصل, and it's irrespective of whether the mouth of that pig had touched the water or not. So the moment an animal like a pig that is intrinsically impure falls into a well, all that water becomes impure. إذا وقع في البئر حيوان ليس بنجس العين, if an animal that is not intrinsically impure falls into a well, ولكن سؤره نجس, but its leftover water is regarded as impure, and we discussed this in our last lesson, then وجب إخراج ما في البئر من الماء, then too it will be necessary for one to remove all the water of that well. إذا وقع في البئر إنسان, if a human being falls inside a well, وخرج من البئر حيا, and he comes out from the well alive, ولم تكن على بدنه نجاسة, and there were no traces of impurity or no impurities on his body, then لا يكون الماء نجسا, and naturally the water of that well will not be regarded as impure. And similarly, إذا وقع في البئر بغل أو حمار أو صقر أو حدأ, that if a donkey or a mule or a falcon or a kite falls into a well, وخرج حيا, and such a bird or animal comes out alive, then ولم تكن له على بدنه نجاسة, and if there is no impurity on its body, then لا يكون الماء نجسا, then the water will not be regarded as impure إذا لم يصل فمه إلى الماء, when its mouth does not reach or touch the water. And then the scholars go on to explain a very important principle, that وإذا وصل لعاب الواقع في الماء, that when the saliva of that creature falling into the well reaches the water, فهو في حكم سؤره, then it is in the same ruling as its leftover water, as we had discussed in our previous lesson. إذا مات في البئر حيوان ليس فيه دم سائل لا يكون الماء نجسا, when a creature or an animal falls into a well, and such a creature or animal that does not have flowing blood within it falls into a well, then the water will not be regarded as impure. The water of that well will not be regarded as impure. And a simple example of an animal or a creature that does not have flowing blood within it would be a bug or a fly or a wasp, for example. Similarly, the scholars explain that إذا مات في البئر حيوان, that if a certain creature falls into a well, يولد ويعيش في الماء, it gives birth in the water and it lives in water, then obviously لا ينجس الماء, that well water will not become impure. So examples of animals that or creatures that give birth in water and live in water would be stomach, fish, ضفدع, frogs, certain types of frogs, or saratan, crayfish as well, or in a more broader sense, crustaceans. So if such creatures fall into the well, it will not contaminate its water. In مات في البئر حيوان كبير, if a larger animal falls into a well, such as a dog or a sheep, or perhaps مات فيها إنسان, or a human being fell inside a well and died, then even though أخرج فورا قبل الانتفاخ, even though they were removed immediately and they didn't float up in the water after death, that water will still be impure and it will be necessary to remove all the water of that well. So if a dog falls in a well, even though you took that dog out immediately, the water in that well becomes impure. Or a sheep, or a person falls into the well. In the first scenario we mentioned, a person falls in the well, comes out alive, and there's no traces of impurity on his body, the water remains pure. But if a person falls in the well and dies in the well, that well water will become impure even though the person is taken out immediately after death and the body did not yet float up. And then the scholars explain that يكفي إخراج 200 دلو وسط في جميع هذه المسائل التي يجب فيها إخراج جميع ما في البئر من الماء إن لم يمكن إخراج جميع الماء. That in all of these masail that we had just discussed, all along since the beginning of this lesson, where the scholars explain that all the water will have to be removed, all the water will have to be removed, all the water will have to be removed. Scholars explain that if it is difficult to remove all the water, then 200 average sized buckets of water should be taken out. And even though all the water of the well is not taken out, but those 200 average sized buckets of water have been taken out of the well, that will be fine. They also explain that if a cat or a chicken died in a well, then it will be sufficient to remove 40 average sized buckets of water from the well, and the remainder of the water will then be pure. And if it is something a bit more smaller, like an osfur or fa'ra, if it is a sparrow or a rat that died in a well, then it will be sufficient to remove 20 average sized buckets of water. The remainder of the water will then be regarded as pure. And the scholars further go on to say that إذا أخرج المقدار الواجب من الماء صارت البئر طاهرة. When a person takes out the prescribed number of buckets of water from the well to purify it, then the well naturally becomes pure. And in that whole cleaning process, the bucket, the rope, person's hand that's being used to put the bucket and lower the bucket into the well, everything becomes pure. And لا تكون البئر نجسة إذا وقعت فيها الروث والبعر والقثاء. That a well will not become impure when droppings of certain animals fall into the well. So, for example, droppings of a horse, of a donkey, of a mule, or droppings of a camel, or droppings of a sheep, or goat, or gazelle, or even droppings of a cow or a buffalo. Their droppings, if it falls into a well, it will not render the water of that well impure, except in the scenario where it's such a large amount of droppings that it, so to say, fills one bucket. If that is the case, then the water of that well will be regarded as impure. And then they go on to say that if it's just, small droppings of a dove or a sparrow that fell into a well, then its water will not become impure. In the concluding masail pertaining to this topic, the scholars mention that إذا مات في البئر حيوان, that if an animal dies in a well and its body had already bloated, and a person does not know when exactly they fell into that well, when that animal fell into the well, and they use that water to make wudu, and they perform salah, then the scholars say that we can just take it in the ruling that this animal had uh, been there for 3 days and 3 nights for ease, just to make it easy for us. So if a person, again, made wudu using the water of a well in which an animal died and its body floated in the water, then a person will have to repeat the salahs for 3 days and 3 nights. Since the time the person made wudu on that water and they just carried on in the state of wudu or carried on using that water, then we would say, okay, if it was 5 days since they've been using that water, then they would have to repeat the salahs for just 3 days and 3 nights. And the remainder of the days and nights that they were using the water, that would be fine. And in the scenario where the body had not bloated, then it will be assumed that that animal had died for a period of 1 day and 1 night. So if you used water from a well in which an animal died, but later on when you looked deeply into the well and you saw the animal died, but the body was not bloated, then in that case, if you had performed your salah using obviously by means of the wudu that you attained through the water of that particular well, where the animal had not bloated, and let's say you perform 2 days of salah, 2 full days of salah, all you have to do is repeat the salah for the first day and the first night, right? The first 24 hours. After that, the salahs will be acceptable if you continued using that water. So again, if the animal bloated, then you will have to repeat your salah. Obviously, you have to repeat your wudu and everything, and you repeat the salah for 3 days and 3 nights since you started using that water. And if the animal had not bloated, then you will repeat your salah for 1 day and 1 night since you started using that water. The remainder of the nights thereafter or days, that will be fine, that will be permissible. There would be no issue with that. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us the understanding of these masail. We don't know when we would end up in this particular scenarios. That's why it is important for us to learn. Sometimes we may think that okay, if I end up in a jam, it's fine. I'll just, maybe contact some scholar and he'll be able to tell me. But we never know when we might be faced with such a situation where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala may place us in in a state of survival mode, and we come across a well, and obviously salah continues, life continues, and we need to be doing the right thing at all times. So though many might think that these masail are not relevant, they are quite relevant, and maybe they may not be applicable, but they are relevant and will always remain relevant. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us the understanding. In our next lesson, inshallah, we will be talking about the etiquette of relieving oneself, which is something that's very, very important, because if a person relieves themselves and do not purify themselves in the correct manner, that may compromise their salah and every other act of worship. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant us the understanding and the tawfiq to grasp all of these important rulings. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to get in touch with us. This has probably been brought to you by Muslim Online. Jazakumullah khaira. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.